So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second in our second semester iteration of the Iscia seminar series, Horizon 2055. And today I'm very happy to introduce you to Aragorn Eloff. Aragorn is a postdoc in philosophy at Pretoria University, interested in the interfaces between philosophies and life sciences and neuroscience and psychedelics. And I think I can happily characterize Aragorn as a multiplex being, and maybe exemplary of the multiplexes that we all need to become or start becoming, I guess, if we are hoping to fabulate sustainable futures for ourselves and for the creatures and forces we are embedded in. So I've encountered the being of Aragorn in very different guises. I mean, it has appeared in this paradoxical guise of a very carefully constructed logical argument for pretty wild ideas, and in the kind of disconcerting guise, I think, as a problem creator for very conventional ideas. So I'm very excited now to encounter him in another guise, that of an exploratory musician who's developed what he's called Sonopoietics. I hope I'm saying that right. Which, if I read him right, is kind of entangles bodies and climate and plants and all sorts of ecological dynamics to compose music, he says, with the forces of the cosmos. So if this is part of our future, I'm very excited and very curious to take a look. And with that, thanks very much for joining us today, Aragorn, and over to you.
Cool. Okay, I'm going to start just by sharing my screen. And let's make sure I'm sharing sound and everything. There we go. So you guys should be seeing my screen now.
Yes, perfect.
Okay. And what I'm going to do, I don't have the best internet connection today, so hopefully we all survive. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to mostly just focus on explaining my musical practice and talking about how I've started to think slightly philosophically about that musical practice. And this is a process that happened sort of quite organically. I've been making music for a very long time in very different ways and very different genres of music. And it's never really until recently been a very thought out process. It's just sort of been a completely intuitive, creative process. But in recent years, I've started to recognize that the ways in which I'm approaching composition and improvisation and everything else kind of has some philosophical implications and intersects in a really, for me, a very surprising way with the sort of all the sort of philosophy that I'm into, which, yeah, as most of you probably know, is like Deleuze and Guattari and Gilbert Simondon and all these sort of philosophers of complexity and becoming and unfolding processes. But I'm going to start off just by talking about my music and my process a little bit, and particularly about modular synthesizers, which is what I use for most of my music. And then I'll go into the philosophical sort of reflections that I've started to develop just a little bit. And it's not going to be very philosophically deep. I just want to sort of throw some ideas out there. And I'm actually really interested to hear what other people think as well about potentially other sort of philosophical implications of what I'm trying to do with sound. So the way I'm currently describing this is with the term sonopoietics, and it's got sort of resonances with the term autopoiesis. And for those of you who are not familiar with the term autopoiesis, it just means self-making, and it comes from these Chilean biologists, Maturana and Varela. And it's a way in which they try to describe living systems as they sort of endure as living systems in the world by sort of producing the conditions that lead to their own endurance as living systems, right? So it's a kind of self-generating principle of life, of living biological organization. And I'm trying to apply the same principle of self-generating dynamic processes to sound, to the compositional process. And I'm particularly interested in this being a sort of participatory practice. So not being a sort of unilateral imposition of me and my will on the compositional process, but sort of creating an ecology of compositional dynamisms where I'm sort of just one participant among many. And we'll see as I start sharing some examples of this, what that actually means. So here's a picture of Gilles Deleuze playing a modular synthesizer. And in fact, Deleuze speaks about modular synthesizers quite a bit in his writing. It's not something people usually pick up on because it's quite tangential to his sort of, the stuff that he's most focused on. But in his book on Francis Bacon, he talks about modular synthesizers being non-representational and relating them to continuous multiplicities, to continuous flows and dynamisms. And he contrasts that to digital synthesizers, which for him typifies digitality more generally, which is the logic of the discrete, the discontinuous, the representational, all of this kind of stuff. And obviously Deleuze is usually in favor of the continuous and the non-representational. And this comes out when he speaks about pedagogy, and he speaks about what he construes as the process of learning. And he says, learning is never about representation. It's never about sort of adopting or imposing a model. Instead, it's about entangling yourself into some part of the world that you're exploring and undergoing a sort of experimental becoming with that part of the world, right? Entering into these sort of continuous flows and dynamisms as an ongoing process of the unfolding of learning. And the way he says it in different repetition is really nice. He says learning takes place not in the relation between a representation and an action, which would just reproduce the same, right? There's no novelty in that. There's nothing new in that. But instead, learning takes place in the relation between a sign and a response, or an encounter with the other. This idea of the other in Deleuze is really interesting. He sometimes talks about it in terms of the outside as well, in terms of being open to the outside. And for me, this is kind of something I think about in terms of my compositional process, is I want my compositional process to be open to the outside as well. I don't want to create a closed little space where I'm in unilateral control of the sounds that I compose, but I want to expose that. I want to render it sort of fragile and imbricated in the sort of like surrounding ecologies. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my own sort of musical process and where that came from. I'm going to play you a bunch of examples, some sound clips, some video clips. But I've been making music for a really long time. I started off making sort of very, quite predictable forms of dance music in the 90s. Then I was interested more in sort of electronica and ambient music. But by kind of the mid-2000s, I was really interested in music that composed itself. So creating conditions and sets of rules and allowing the music to emerge from those sets of rules. And at the time, I was working as a software developer. And so I was programming a lot of algorithms to generate music. And I was analyzing a lot of data and transforming data into sound, or into a set of parameters that would influence sound. So for instance, one of the pieces I programmed was using the genome of the most highly sequenced variant of the Ebola virus. This was during the Ebola outbreak in 2014, which I wanted to respond to in an artistic way somehow. So I created a sonic piece where certain parameters of the Ebola genome entered into the compositional process and created sort of variations in the melodic and rhythmic and overall compositional structure of the piece. I also worked a lot with big data, with data sets, where I would bring in stuff like fitness tracking and my online sort of profile, all the data that was accumulated from me using all these online services. And I fed that into a piece I called Fuck Off Google. I also did a piece in response to exploitation in the mining sector, where I took stock market data and trade volume of platinum in the mineral sector over a couple of years, and then I fed that into the production of a sonic piece. And then Sound of the Eye, I kind of programmed this thing that would analyze people's irises and people's retina. So it would pick up the sort of singularity of people's eyes. And typically this is the kind of thing nowadays that's used for secure verification, right? Instead of passwords, you can have a fingerprint or you can have a retina scan because our eyes are all unique. And I was interested in taking that away from the domain of sort of control and surveillance and presenting it in the domain of sort of creative expression. So I wrote a piece where people would send me their photos of their eyes, and each photo of an eye would generate a different piece of music. But this sounds very abstract. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see a very, very, very simple, like baby example of the kind of algorithm that I'm talking about that would generate these kinds of things. But I'm going to play you a little example. This is kind of my favorite example of the work I've done using sort of algorithmic programmatic techniques. And it's a piece called Factory Farm Studies. And what I did in this is I got data from factory farms. So the rate at which animals are slaughtered in factory farms. And then I also got sonic recordings from factory farms. And I analyzed the sort of frequency distribution and the changes in frequency distribution. And then I took a whole lot of other data about the externalities of factory farms, so the ecological impact of factory farming and so on. And I combined all that data in order to generate different pieces of piano music. And I looked at 4 different animals. I looked at pigs, sheep, cows, and chickens. And using the same algorithm, I just fed the data from each of those 4 different animals in factory farms into the algorithm to generate 4 very, very different pieces of music. So I'm just going to play you about a minute of sheep, which is my favorite one. I don't know if you guys are familiar with how many animals are killed for food and clothing and so on every year, but it's vast, vast numbers. Every note, every piano note you hear in the piece I'm going to play represents 10 sheep being slaughtered. That's the rate at which sheep are slaughtered. So hopefully you can hear. Okay, so, and of course, if I play chicken is much, much faster than that and has totally different sort of pitches and melodic structure, different key signature, and so on. So I'm very interested in this idea of also singular and non-repeating music. You know, Deleuze has this beautiful term in his philosophy, hexaity. And hexaity is kind of roughly translated as the idea of thisness, the singular sort of heterogeneities of a single moment, a single place, a single time, a single expression, a single becoming. So for me, creating these pieces of music that either sound different every time they're played or sound different based on what data they're translating is very important. I'm kind of less interested in the idea of music as this repeatable form that has to be faithfully replayed or that can be mass produced. Yeah, I prefer sonic expression as sort of reflective of the space in which it's being expressed. So it's kind of an immanent expression of the space. But I got really bored with algorithmic music at a certain point and with computers in general, probably because I was working as a programmer And then I would come home and try to be creative on the same technology that I was working on during the day. So I discovered modular synthesis, which is a completely different way to approach composition, and doesn't involve a computer at all. And in fact, can be done without any digital technologies. I use a couple of sort of digital aspects in my own compositional process, but typically, especially when modular synthesis first came about, everything was analog. And there's something sort of very interesting about moving away from the digital in a sort of highly digital age towards these older forms of technology. But modular synthesis is not a very well-known approach to composing music. And when you talk about synthesizers, typically what people have in mind is they have in mind something that looks like a piano keyboard, and then it's maybe got a bunch of like knobs and sliders on top of it, and you play it like you would play a piano, but maybe you have different sounds coming out based on your settings. And what those kinds of synthesizers are is they represent someone else making a set of decisions for you about how all the elements that enter into composing a particular sound, how those elements should be connected together. And those kinds of synthesizers actually came around later in sort of technological development than modular synthesizers. The very first synthesizers came about in the sort of 60s, late 60s, early 70s, and they were all modular. So Moog is probably the best known one. And then two other early sort of synthesizer developers were Buchla and Serge. And their idea was to sort of break the production of sound down into discrete little elements, into individual little elements. And it was up to users of these systems to decide how those elements would be connected together in order to create an instrument. So you would have individual little modules, and those modules all operated with the same sort of flows of electricity. And by just connecting modules to each other with cables, you were basically allowing that electricity to flow in a particular way. So you were creating an electronic circuit, and that would create an instrument. And that instrument is kind of a transient instrument, because when you pull out those cables, that instrument doesn't exist anymore. So the instrument doesn't exist in any one of the modules by itself. It's kind of an assemblage, to use Deleuzean language. It's a particular agencying or assemblage that comes about by composing a certain set of relations. So again, to use like Deleuze language, these patch cables will be almost like the dark precursor that brings these different modules, these different series into relation with each other. But very simply put, I can show you like a little quick example here. So an individual module can look very simple. It performs a very simple function usually. So this is a Boolean logic module. It's a bit, it's coming apart a little bit. I need to resolder it. This is a slightly more modern module that uses sort of more modern components. But each of these things either makes a sound, it can make a tone, it can change that tone, it can modify a sound, or it can be a control voltage, which means that it modulates or changes a certain parameter to do with the overall composition in a certain way. So it's a very open-ended and exploratory approach to making music. And for me, it's almost like a meta instrument, because every time I patch together my modular system, I'm exploring new ways of creating a space of possibility for sonic expression. I'm not bound to someone else's decisions about how the particular elements of sound should be arranged in order to do that. So these are some examples of really old Buchla modules from the 60s. And it's a mixer, which mixes together different sounds. It's a ring modulator, which transforms two sounds together to create a new sort of timbral variation on the sound. And it's a filter, which changes the harmonics of the sound. And I actually find these quite beautiful, these old modules. They're often very organic in the way they've been soldered together. They're often not on printed circuit boards. People build their own circuit boards for them even. And sometimes they're even created without circuit boards, just people wiring together these raw components. But I got particularly interested when I was sort of first diving into modular synthesis. I got particularly interested in what's called the West Coast philosophy. So when modular synthesis first came about, they were typified in terms of two approaches and two different coasts. So on the east coast of the US, in New York, there was a guy named Robert Moog, and Robert Moog invented what's called the Moog modular synthesizer, and it's probably the most famous one. If you ever see a movie with a modular synth in, it's usually a Moog synth. And a lot of famous sort of prog rock bands in the 70s had giant Moog synths up on stage with them. Pink Floyd used a Moog synth. But Robert Moog's approach was he wanted modular synthesizers to be musical in a way that could allow you to perform traditional music. So his design approach was to create all these sort of elements that, when put together in the right way, would allow people to, for instance, recreate a piece of music by Bach. In fact, there's a very famous album by Wendy Carlos, who did the soundtrack to Clockwork Orange, called Everything You Ever Wanted to Hear on the Moog, But We're Afraid to Ask. And on that album, she performs a whole lot of really beautiful Bach pieces on modular synth. So that's the East Coast philosophy. It was much more about an instrument that could be used to reproduce the Western canon. But on the West Coast, in California, where the hippie revolution was at its strongest and people were dropping a lot of acid and everything, Don Buchler and people around Don Buchler decided that they wanted to create these instruments that allowed us to explore sound in completely new ways that didn't necessarily have any loyalty to any particular musical tradition or canon. So the West Coast philosophy is usually typified as being a lot more futuristic and a lot less informed by classical Western assumptions of things like musical scales and Western modes of performability. I'm going to play you a little excerpt of, also I should say, the West Coast philosophy was much more about music that could be sort of autopoietic or self-generating. So I'm going to play you a little excerpt of a classic sort of West Coast piece of music. This is played on a booklet system. Okay, you get the idea. A lot of sci-fi movies from the 60s and 70s used Buchla synths to generate the sound effects, as you can imagine. What's very interesting here is already here in this patch, you see the interplay between a human composer performer and the synthesizer itself. So it's a semi-self-generating patch. It's got its own sort of behavior based on sort of stochastic dynamics, based on randomness, based on flows of uncertainty. And those are being engaged with by a human performer who's sort of participating in those flows and trying to modulate those flows in certain directions. So there's a sort of, there's a co-improvisation between machine and user. So I'm more influenced by the West Coast philosophy than by the East Coast philosophy, but I kind of wanted to move beyond both of them in my own practice. And I became more and more interested in flows from the outside. And so trying to do the same thing as I was doing back when I was making algorithmic music on computers, I started exploring ways in which I could do a similar thing on a modular synthesizer. And the first thing I came across is that you could build a module that measured biofeedback from plants and then took that plant, those voltage dynamics from the plant behavior into a modular synthesizer and allowed you to use that to transform various other parameters within the synth. So for instance, you could use changes in the fluctuations of biofeedback of the plant to produce certain rhythmic structures or certain melodic structures, or change the timbral properties of a sound. So here's a very simple piece where I was first exploring this kind of technique. And here I was hooked up to, I can't remember what kind of cactus it was, but it was a cactus that I'd hooked this little module up to, and I was changing various parameters. So the cactus was in essence playing the modular synth for me. And what I found really interesting about this was that different plants had such different responses. So the way it works is you're just using a little, some little pads that the same as the pads you'd use if you're doing like an EEG or something, little sensor pads, and you're putting them on the different sort of leaves of the plant or parts of the plant, and it's measuring differences in electrical potential and electrical fluctuations between those parts of the plant. Different plants express themselves in such different ways in such different contexts. This is really obvious, but when you actually experience it in this way, when you sonify it, you have a new mode of sort of phenomenological encounter with plants and plant dynamics, right? So, so if I have a plant hooked up to my modular and the plant is doing its thing, if I touch a leaf or I water the plant, or even sometimes if I move another plant near to it, it can completely change what that plant is doing, which for me is quite fascinating. It's really, it's given me a sort of very different intuitive understanding of plant life. One thing I'll do as well, I often perform live with plants, and I'll always ask the organizer of the event to find the plant for me that they think will perform musically in an interesting way. So I don't like choosing my own plants when I perform live. I like improvising with plants that I've never encountered before. And that makes it really fun to play live, to have a live sort of improvisational encounter with plant life. I'm also very interested in integrating human bodies into the compositional process in unfamiliar ways. So some of the work I've done is with gestural control of music, where human body movement can define a whole bunch of different musical parameters. So you create a sort of compositional space in which people can explore with all their different limbs and all their sort of styles of movement. And that can be used to modulate a synthesizer in various ways. And for me, what's really beautiful about that is you can put people in front of a gestural system that have never played music before, that have never expressed themselves through sound before, but everyone has a particular relation to their own body and is able to express themselves with their own body in a particular way. And that leads to really interesting musical results. So I'll play you a little clip of a performance I did where my partner Chantal was the gestural performer. Chantal's actually a really great classically trained musician, but it's interesting to see what she did with a gestural setup. So let me play you just a tiny bit of that. One thing I really enjoy about creating these kinds of gestural spaces as well is that they kind of exceed the amount of control a human being can have over them. Because the motion sensors that I'm using can pick up so many different parameters. They map different limbs of your body with a huge amount of detail in 3D space, and also map your position within that space. So you have something like 120 different parameters that you can ostensibly control just with the movement of your body. And of course, no one can remember an instrument with 120 different parameters that you can adjust at once. So it leads to this very intuitive approach to exploring a sonic space where your kind of your rational mind tends to shut down a bit, and it's not so much trying to memorize what certain gestures will do, but instead constructing this sort of ongoing immanent relationship between yourself and the sound that you're hearing. And it's really wonderful to watch people exploring these sonic spaces and sort of feeling that immediate sort of feedback between themselves and the sound that's being expressed in the space. One of the things I'm most interested in integrating is the kinds of dynamics that typify real-world natural systems. So for any of you who are familiar with chaos theory or complex dynamic systems theory, natural systems tend to be nonlinear. They tend to be not at equilibrium. They're far from equilibrium. They're turbulent. They're dynamic. They exist at points close to chaotic criticality. The most famous example of this is when we talk about the weather or the climate. We often talk about it in terms of having critical thresholds, right? That's why conversations around climate change tipping points are so important, because climate is a nonlinear system, right? Small perturbations can lead to large consequences in a nonlinear system. And nonlinear dynamics are very interesting. So chaotic systems are not entirely predictable, but they're not entirely random either. They exist somewhere on the threshold between predictability and randomness. And so they exhibit this really kind of complex patterned behavior, which in Deleuzean language would just be difference and repetition, right? So it's the semi sort of cyclical behavior of these repeated sort of refrains and dynamics. But every time there's a repetition, it's a repetition with a little bit of difference. I'll show you an image later, but I'm going to play you just a minute of an explanatory video I made about chaos, just so it makes a little bit more sense to you. So that's chaos, but chaos doesn't always need to sound like that. Here's a much more musical example where I used a hyperchaotic circuit and I kind of conformed it to a certain extent to a sort of Western musical idiom to create something that's a little bit more musical, but all of the parameters you hear here, so the tempo, the pitch, the chord changes, everything in this piece is controlled by hyperchaos. I love about sort of creating compositional spaces in this way as well is that these things never repeat. So I could leave this running for like 100 years and it would just evolve and surprise me sometimes, would bifurcate like chaotic systems do, and some new sort of musical theme would emerge. And often my own musical practice involves me patching together one of these spaces and then just sitting and listening to it unfold for an afternoon or an evening, just listening to a system express itself in its own sort of potentialities. So it's creating these spaces of becoming that that are able to continue to surprise you no matter how long you listen to them. Yeah, and in case that sort of module in this video looks a bit weird, it's because I hadn't finished soldering it yet. I was kind of testing it out. So it didn't even have a front panel on or anything. It was just a raw electronic circuit with some LEDs attached to it. And then recently I've also been bringing in parts of the immediate environment. So in this module, in this patch, I have a light sensing circuit that senses fluctuations in red, green, blue, and infrared light. And then I've also got a climate sensor that's measuring the humidity, the temperature, the atmospheric pressure, and the altitude. So those can then be used to modulate all sorts of different parameters within the patch as well. So again, sort of bringing out this notion of hexaity, that the conditions in which you perform very much affect the expression of a particular piece. So I could create the exact same musical patch, and using these sort of these climactic inputs, that piece would sound totally different depending on where I performed it. You know, if I performed it outside or in Cape Town somewhere or on a plane or whatever. So here's a bit of the weather composing a piece of music. Yeah, and I mean, as you can see, these modular synthesizers can be as simple or complex as you want. You can create wonderful patches just with 2 modules and a very, very simple 3 or 4 cables, or you can just create like a giant spaghetti monster where you switch it on the next day and you have no idea what you did the day before, and it's just this alien creature making bizarre sounds at you. So I tend more towards the giant spaghetti monster approach to making these spaces, because I kind of like also forgetting what it is I've done and sort of, yeah, allowing myself to be surprised on that level too. And of course, giant squid brains are really important as well. So that's giant squids are very interesting because their neuronal dynamics exhibit mathematically chaotic behavior. So just like those sort of other natural systems that trace those interesting patterns of difference and repetition that are nonlinear and chaotic and close to criticality, the neuronal dynamics of giant squid brains look a lot like those classic butterfly patterns. And so these Japanese researchers who are super into these kinds of chaotic systems and implementing them within electronic circuitry, designed an electronic circuit that emulates that neuronal activity. So I'm using that to control all the sort of pitch and rhythmic and timbral dynamics of what you just heard. Because it would be a bit cruel to hook up a giant squid for real and plug things into its brain. But so my current practice kind of combines all of this. I'm very interested in plugging all those different things that I just showed you together and creating these compositional spaces and inviting other people in to explore them. So here is, I was at a Deleuze conference in Sweden earlier this year, and it was really lovely because they allowed space for people to present creative practices. So it wasn't all just people sitting down and talking like hardcore Deleuzean language. It was also lots of space for art and creativity. And I set up a little modular system and connected a whole bunch of people to that modular system. So, and a whole bunch of non-human sort of participants as well. So the climate, the light, the person on the right has their heart rate being monitored with a little cable that's going to their ear. The person standing next to me has a muscle sensor, so he's sort of flexing his muscles, and the sort of electrical dynamics from that are informing the patch as well. A plant is participating, people are interacting with the plant. And I'm kind of really interested. I've just started experimenting with this practice now of sort of inviting other people in and creating a sort of collective assemblage expression. But I'm really interested in the experience it affords people, not just in being able to express themselves sonically, but in being co-participants, in being just some of the sort of agents involved in the emergence of these sort of complex sonic spaces. So no one person is unilaterally in control of a particular thing. And the way I usually set these up is that everyone is in a little bit of a cybernetic loop with everyone else. Everyone's kind of connected to what everyone else is doing. So you might think that every time you interact with a certain thing in a certain way, it's going to have a certain effect. But then it's also going to be influenced by other interactions coming from other people, from plants, from the environment, from the chaotic circuitry, and so on. So it involves a real sensitivity to sort of recognizing the dynamics of the space and entering into the dynamics of that space. So just what Deleuze says about learning being the sort of entanglement of the singular points of your body with the singular points of the water, it's a similar kind of experience of participation. And here's another example of this just in my lounge. I invited a whole lot of people around to connect to the modular in different ways. And for a lot of people, it's the first time they've seen a modular since or heard sonic expression of this kind. And it's really always wonderful. It's really rewarding for me always to kind of see the kinds of spaces that people collectively compose and the kinds of sensitivities it cultivates between people, because you're not just encountering sonic space, you're encountering the other people and the other non-human participants within that space in a novel way. And you're part of a sort of unfolding hexaety. So I've started thinking of this, Deleuze and Guattari have this beautiful way of saying it in A Thousand Plateaus, where they talk about composing with the forces of the cosmos, right? Bringing everything in, a generalized chromaticism. And I've started thinking about it in terms of what I call a pedagogy of non-mastery. I'm really not interested in the idea of mastering a musical instrument or musical style or performative process. I'm much more interested in this pedagogy of non-mastery. And I think that it has implications that go beyond just performance and creativity. For me, it's got sort of political implications too, and ethical and aesthetic implications. I kind of really think of it as a challenge to what Deleuze calls the dogmatic image of thought, which is this sort of idea that thought is somehow sufficient to the world and that we can sort of develop an objectively correct or final approach to the ways in which we relate to reality and each other and to ourselves. So I kind of like this idea of radical insufficiency, of creating a space where you're kind of drawn up against your own sort of finitude, and your own sort of only partial intersection with a space of creative possibility, but kind of seeing that as enough. So not trying to cultivate mastery of any kind, and kind of setting the parameters of these spaces up so that the closer you get towards the idea that you're mastering something, the more that space kind of collapses around you. So yeah, just creating a kind of a creative humility is probably one of the ways I put it. But Saidiya Hartman actually puts it far better than me. And she's this beautiful book of hers, Wayward Life's Beautiful Experiments. She describes it like this. And I think she's not speaking about music, but I was struck when I was reading the book at just how similar it was to a lot of the ideas I'm trying to articulate with my sonic practice. So what she says, and she's talking more about political organization here, but we can think about it in a lot of different registers. The chorus is the vehicle for another kind of story, not of the great man or of the tragic hero, but one in which all modalities play a part, where the headless group incites change, where mutual aid provides the resource for collective action, not leader in mass, where the untranslatable songs and seeming nonsense make good the promise of revolution. The chorus propels transformation. It is an incubator of possibility, an assembly sustaining dreams of the otherwise. The struggle is eternal. Somebody else carries on. The bodies are in motion. The gestures disclose what is at stake. The matter of life returns as an open question. The collective movement points towards what awaits us, what has yet to come into view, what they anticipate. The time and place better than here, a glimpse of the earth not owned by anyone. So everything depends on them and not on the hero occupying center stage, preening and sovereign. Inside the circle, it is clear that every song is the same song, but crooned in infinite variety. Every story altered and unchanging. How can I live? I want to be free. Hold on. So that's basically me. And I didn't speak too much about, well, maybe I did, but hopefully I didn't throw too much sort of Deleuzean language out there. I didn't want it to be like incredibly sort of philosophical. I more wanted to share just an ongoing practice of exploration, because by no means have I mastered my own approach to this whole thing that I'm trying to patch together either. But if you want to hear more of my work, I released an album of generative piano music recently on my Bandcamp, and my website, fur.co.za, has a sort of brief background and links to some of my music and some of my sort of previous experiments. And that is me.
Wonderful, Aragorn. Thank you. Wow. I feel quite blown away. There's yeah, and I can see responses are all coming up, hearts and claps, and wow. Okay, so look, I've got 1,000 things that I want to question you about, but I'm not going to abuse my position as a host because I can actually chat to you afterwards if I need to. So if there's somebody who has sort of comments, questions, apart from wow, that was amazing, don't say that 100 times, we know this, then would you yeah, raise your hand. I see Momo has a hand raised, and I'm going to yeah, immediately go over to you. So yeah, if you'd like to pop your video on and unmute. Or do I have to unmute you?
No, I'm not.
Fab.
Thank you
Fab.
very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Aragorn, how's it going? Cool. I just wanted to the thing I've been thinking about is there seems to be in your work, especially with Deleuze, there's a beautiful sense of wanting to form connections. And especially when you're looking at connecting with the plant and the sounds that came with the sonics that came about that dialogue. But there's also a sense of we cannot actually even ever reach that. And I wondered, what do you think in terms of the metaphysical implications, not in terms of defining the metaphysics, but more of in terms of how let us say, those who are, how's that word? Like, sorry, in terms of how does one interact with those who, in a sense, refuse to want to have that connection and would see you as such and such? How would, in a sense, what are your, sorry, my ways of working today, how would your, in a sense, your work and the work with Deleuze and with music, how do you see that music, how do you see that the instrument, in a sense, trying to bridge that gap, or maybe not even bridge that gap, just trying to bring us closer to having some form of connection to those that we cannot connect? I don't know if that makes sense. Thank you.
That's a really good question. And, I think about it a lot in terms of how I choose to translate all of this stuff, all of these flows into a particular kind of sonic expression, because, that sort of the one chaos video I showed, it was very abstract music, right? It's very abstract sound art, and that could be super alienating for people. On the other hand, you can be really contrived and create something that's very sort of musically formulaic, and you can say, oh, well, a plant is playing this piece of music, but it sounds just like a nursery rhyme. And you catch and lose people at various points along that continuum, right? The more provocative and unfamiliar artistic expression is, the less it's going to, sometimes the less it's going to draw people in, although sometimes you'll be surprised at the strange things that draw people in. But it's for me, it's an ongoing tension of how do I welcome people into these exploratory spaces gently, in a way that's not super alienating and doesn't just throw a whole bunch of like wild noise at them, but in a way that still is disruptive and still cultivates a little bit of a line of flight or something. And I think Deleuze and Guattari are actually good here, because they say, when you're rearranging the flows of desire, right? They've got the whole schizoanalytic project, and it's about looking at how your desire has been arranged, and then saying, hey, if that arrangement of desire doesn't suit me, I'm going to arrange desire differently. And that's a collective practice. But the most important thing they always say is arrange it carefully, right? You don't want to just create the line of abolition. You want to cultivate these spaces of unfolding possibility very gently and in a way that's as collectively beneficial as possible. But I think it's necessarily like an experimental approach. There's no one right final way to do this, and even our best attempts can fall short sometimes and alienate people. So
yeah, thanks Aragorn.
Thanks,
Alex, and thanks Mama for your question, really wonderful. But okay, so Alex, and then I think there's Emma was in the chat. So maybe first Alex and then Emma, and then we'll take further calls, questions.
Yeah, Aragorn, I won't say that was amazing. I'll instead say something like, I rarely listen to something that in space of 40 minutes blows my mind more than once in more than one way. So thank you. That was fascinating and beautiful. And while I collect the pieces of my mind together, it just struck me, because I'm sort of a bit of a Luddite in the sense that I'm quite intimidated by the collection of wires that you use to make music with. And this opened me up to a way to explore with and play with that technology, which was such a wonderful experience. So thank you. I feel more inspired to experiment. So, I mean, that's quite a dramatic achievement in the context of my life to give me that inspiration. And what your presentation, the way that you could sonify chaos and how you spoke of chaos and its relation with time really made me think that it's actually a much more accurate way of describing the course of a relationship, particularly in therapy, which is so misdescribed by a sense of linear time. That's very chaotic, but it's not random. And so thank you. The presentation is going to be a wonderful source of food for thought. I'm not particularly familiar with Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy, but I was wondering if you could speak more about his distinction between representation and the sign as a way of reproducing the same, and the other being a relationship with the other. That that of the many things that was compelling. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, that's a big, it's a big topic in Deleuze. So it's probably like a whole dissertation there of, like, Deleuze's critique of representation. But essentially, if you think, like, one of the things Deleuze wants to do is that he doesn't want to think just in terms of the established, right, of what's given to us. Like, oh, this is the world, let's make an ontology around it, let's build our metaphysics around that and everything, like done and dusted, right? He's more interested in what gives rise to all that stuff. So what are the underlying sort of dynamisms and creative processes? So instead of the ontology, what's the ontogenesis, right? What is that by which the given is given? And that's his whole sort of philosophy of difference, right? He says, well, identity is secondary. It's these sort of like emergent stabilizations from this underlying sort of interplay of differentiation without an image. And when you're thinking in terms of representation, you're thinking in terms of the established, right? You're thinking in terms of a bunch of discrete identities. They're like the little Lego blocks of thought, and you can put them together in certain ways, and you can articulate a whole bunch of stuff with that. But someone has presented you with those blocks and said, this is the scope of possibility, right? And instead, if you're thinking about what gives rise to that space of possibility, right? Maybe you want to play with clay instead of those blocks, and maybe there are other ways to approach the emergence of representational structures. So it's the same thing as it's the same thing as sort of Deleuze's critique of the notion of sort of desire as lack or desire as interest, right? He's like, well, that's already an established representation of these underlying sub-individual flows that don't necessarily seep into consciousness and can't be expressed or articulated within a certain sort of like psychoanalytic structure, for instance. So that's why he kind of replaces sort of ideas of sort of Freudo-Lacanian psychoanalysis with schizoanalysis, right? This idea that's about like navigating the underlying flows of desire, curating those flows, those singular and ordinary points, and seeing what can be expressed, what emerges from that. That's a very tangential answer. I hope it was an okay one.
Yeah, but thanks anyway. As you said, it's a dissertation. So, thanks, Alex, and thanks, Aragorn. Emma, quick. I have got my eye on time, but there is time.
Thanks so much, Aragorn. Am I on camera? I can't even see. Yes, I am. Okay. Thank you. That was absolutely fabulous. I loved every moment of that. And I'm also mind blown. I've already posted my thoughts in the chat in a wordy kind of as a typing while listening. So just a couple of very quick comments, and that's that I absolutely love what you're doing. It feels like you're doing what I'm always talking about, So by sort of enacting or making performative this ontology that you talk about, this, respect for and understanding of I refer to it as the both and perspective, so the autopoiesis, operational closure and structural openness at the same time, the complexity of that, the both and in living systems, and then capturing that as a point of, as a way of sort of, I hate to say it, but representing the complexity through the sounds that you've created, I think is absolutely beautiful. And the piano with the sheep, where you took every note was 10 sheep slaughtered. That hit me in a way that disrupted or acted as a line of flight or deterritorialized my thinking in a way that no amount of words ever could. So I'm absolutely fascinated. Thank you so much. You'll see in the comments that I've talked about chaos, and it's linked to complexity and fractals, and it's always going through my mind, and I try and show this in a visual way, but you're going way further with this and actually entering into like creating a becoming. So I'm gonna stop blasting. I don't have a question. I'd just like to commend you and say that I'll certainly look to your work in the future.
Thanks. And yeah, fractals are, I mean, I compose with fractal stuff as well. And, fractals exemplify that idea of sort of patterned but non-repetitive dynamics, where you've got like self-similarity, but also idiosyncratic little differences at each sort of scale as you zoom in and out of the fractal.
Yeah.
They're a beautiful example of sort of what Deleuze is getting at, and what I'm trying to get at with, because for me, like, I get so bored by music that's like strictly repetitive, where I can predict what's coming next, and like, here's the chorus, that's the chord change, oh, here's the little melody, and but also, also randomness is not interesting either, right? If it's just random notes following each other, there's nothing there either. So,
you need a refrain.
Yeah, you need a refrain. That refrain needs to be a sort of open-ended, iterative refrain that's sort of evolving and mutating in various ways, and that can sometimes bifurcate and surprise you, right? So fractals are always a good image for me for this. Yeah,
Okay.
I'm trying to read your, but it's long, and I keep losing my place in it.
Aragorn, we're running kind of short of time, but there's something I really, really just want to quickly ask you. And it might be, along with Alex, something very Luddite, but there's one thing that I find kind of curious in your presentation and in your whole practice and all of that. I mean, the shift towards that much more kind of encountering and what would you call it, kind of engagement and collectivity was really interesting. But what I found weird, actually, I think, is the traces of representation that are still there. So for instance, when you were playing the music that comes from the sheep, I was thinking, but it doesn't say sheep to me at all. You could just as well swap the squid brain music with the sheep music, and it would be, it wouldn't mean anything to me that it comes from a sheep, or it comes from a squid brain, or it comes from a plant or a chicken. The forces are recorded, and the representation of what it is that you are recording just doesn't matter, I don't think. But I find it kind of curious that you still said, okay, this is a cactus, and well, that's a sheep, and this is the story behind the sheep, and why? So that was my kind of thought about this. Is there a kind of an almost like a kind of retention of some kind of representational thing that doesn't fit? I don't know. Is that a curveball? I'm not sure, but anyway, yeah.
So this is actually, if I think about the difference between when I was doing the sort of algorithmic stuff on computers with the sheep and whatever, and then when I moved to doing like hooking up plants to modular synthesizers, it's kind of a shift from a more transcendent approach to an immanent one, right? So when I was doing the algorithmic stuff, I'm imposing this unilateral sort of will on the system, right? From the outside, I'm saying, well, I've got all this data from like factory farms. I'm going to translate it into a bunch of numbers. I'm going to write a bunch of code that can turn those numbers into sounds. And for me, that's, there's a kind of artifice there where I'm choosing the representational output, right? But with the sort of modular stuff where I'm just connecting up these flows, typically the way it happens in practice is that I'll say, okay, like I want to explore a plant. I want to be in relation with this plant now. So I hook the plant up. And at first what I do is I'll just hook it up to a single tone, and I'll see how it changes that tone up and down. So I won't contrive anything. I'll just sort of explore the natural dynamics of that plant. So it becomes a much more immanent and unfolding and relational thing where I see what the natural tendencies of I try to sort of glean the natural tendencies of the system that I'm hooking up. And then I sort of allow that to direct me in a certain musical direction. So it's kind of more an immanent unfolding, if that makes sense. And it's obviously, it's to a certain degree, like I'm never going to take myself totally out of the picture as imposing some sort of representational grid on things. But what I find is that since I moved away from like digitality to the analog, to these continuous multiplicities, that it affords me a sort of more immanent mode of sort of ongoing inactive encounter with the world around me, and sort of being faithful to the flows that encounter affords me. So because again, you know, you can, of course, I can hook up my plant and get it to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star if I contrive the whole system enough, right? But I can also just make it make random noises. Neither of those are interesting. So I'm trying to find that liminal space, that sort of, that close to criticality space where I'm still being faithful to what's being expressed by that system, but in a way that's still going to have some sort of aesthetic interest for whoever's listening to it, which is mostly me, you know, as long as I'm happy.
Yeah. We will be too. It's fabulous. It's fantastic. But thank you for that answer. That actually kind of yeah, there's something in that. It's very exciting. I am afraid that we are kind of out of time, and we could keep you here for the whole afternoon, maybe for the whole week or year. It really is, as I mean, I agree with Alex and others that it was pretty mind-blowing and very exciting. And yeah, I just want to say thank you so much for making my week. And yeah, we will hopefully we will be seeing Glenn next week, also a musician. So yeah, Glenn, quite a hard act to follow. And there's throwing out the gauntlet, but Glenn always comes up with something surprising. So yeah, thank you all for joining, and thanks again, Aragorn. I don't want to say goodbye, but I know I have to. So yes, let me just do the awful thing and cut us off. Okay, thanks, man.
Thank you.
Cheers.